Hello and welcome to the Walk Off, everybody. I'm Scott Belford. We have a very special guest for our Friday show here. Joining us once again, it is Buffalo Bison's insider, the writer and creator of the Herd Chronicles, and a man very well versed in everything Toronto Blue Jays, Brian Frank. Welcome back to the Walk Off.
Hey Scott, thanks for having me. It's great to be here again.
Yeah, man. I actually got a chance to read your Kevin Pillar interview
Oh, yeah.
you did at the end of the season. Man, fantastic stuff. Like really good stuff. I actually went back and read after you told me about getting to sit down with Johnny Bench as
Yeah,
well. And
yeah.
honestly, Brian, it is so cool that you have created a platform where you can kind of go back and read up about these, big time Major League Baseball players, Hall of
It's
Fame guys that spent time in Buffalo and actually get to know like what their experience was like as a Bison.
yeah, it was really cool. Like talking to Johnny Bench was just like incredible, obviously, but he just seemed so excited to talk to me. I think I got a sense of excitement that he probably doesn't give in every interview because it was such a different angle than, he's used to talking about like his MVPs or his World Series appearances, but to be able to like talk about his minor league days and kind of reminisce about playing here at the old rock pile in Buffalo and I think he just really enjoyed, being able to reminisce for a little bit. And Pilar, obviously, he's just a world-class guy and he was fantastic to talk to.
It is cool to hear about the beginnings. I think that the struggle just seems to be so much more when you're first starting out, and whatever the industry may be, but baseball definitely tends to be that as well. And it's cool how excited they get. I know we've had on the podcast numerous guys that like the thing that they enjoy talking the most about was their college experience before they even became part of affiliate baseball or a major league player.
Yeah, and I get to talk with so many guys about things like that, like college experience and kind of like coming up through the lower minor leagues and up to Buffalo. So it's just kind of a really, interesting and unique thing to talk about with them.
I know he has not graced Salem Fields with his presence yet, but we just had Peyton Williams on
Yeah.
the show. So he was first baseman for the Vancouver Canadians and probably going to be a Fisher Cat this year. My guess is the way he's hitting. I mean, he lit up the Arizona Fall League. He'll
Yeah.
probably be in Buffalo, and we'll be interviewing down at Salem probably June or July. But it was really cool to talk to him and hear the long list of names that we are talking to already, right? Like when these guys are coming up together and, Trenton Wallace was mentioned, right? Because they went to school together. He was talking about TJ Brock and their experience together. And I know TJ Brock hasn't been with the Bisons yet, but he will be this year
Right.
almost for sure. So it is kind of cool to see how all those ties come together and how so many of them stay strong when they just started out together, right? Because they kind of were in the trenches together.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've noticed in the last like couple years, especially now that we're kind of away from 2020 in the year when there was no minor league baseball. But that was a time that they kind of restructured minor league baseball and got rid of some of the levels, and just how much quicker guys are getting to AAA now. Like, you talk about moving from Vancouver and maybe being in Buffalo next year after a stop at New Hampshire. Like guys just
That
seem like
wasn't the
they're
case before. Yeah.
yeah, you talk to a guy and you'd be talking about like 5 or 6 years in the minor leagues, and now when I go to interview them and I'm doing a little research, I'm like, man, they've only been in the minor leagues for 2 years and they're at AAA already. It's definitely a quicker path to Buffalo, and it's I guess it's just the new way now.
100%. I know Mason Fluardi was a guy that I was like, my eyes popped off the screen when I was like looking him up to talk to him, right? And I'm like,
Yeah,
you've been playing affiliate ball for a year and a half? What?
yeah.
Like,
I know. Jake Bloss is another guy that stands
another
out.
guy.
Like, he came up in the Astros organization, obviously, but I'm like, man, this guy started at like high A this year, and here he is, made it to the majors with the Astros and was at Buffalo. So it's crazy how fast
It
they're getting.
is. It is. And let's dive in about the Blue Jays here. And both these guys we just mentioned, Jake Bloss and Mason Fluharty, very well could fit into the Blue Jays plans in 2025. They have some very heavy lifting to do this offseason if any of the lip service that this front office has been giving is true, right? That they are going to contend in 2025. So let's start with the bullpen because it was for lack of a better term, and not to be disrespectful, but it did feel like a dumpster fire. Like it
Yeah.
finished 30th in all of baseball. It's hard not to describe it as anything but just an absolute nightmare. And I know that we were actually watching one of the problems together, right, in Buffalo, which was a gentleman who in 2023 was the back end guy that wasn't Jordan Romano, right? Like when there was a high leverage situation, I'm of course speaking about Erik Swanson, and we are well aware that he
Yeah.
had some life stuff thrown his way in 2024 that nobody should need to deal with, no parent should need to deal with. And it definitely affected the way that he started the season. And I just don't think he got his feet under him. I know we were watching him in Buffalo, Brian, and almost with a little embarrassment where we're like, oh my God, like he's
You,
just getting
you,
lit up by AAA guys. So,
uh,
my question to you is Erik Swanson could still have it, right? I mean, we know how volatile bullpen arms can be. And I think that after this real struggle of 2024 and the Blue Jays kind of in a surprising way signing him right after watching them
yeah.
non-tender Jordan Romano. It kind of looked like they might go that route with Erik Swanson, but you look at the bullpen and you're like, well, they need some arms, so I guess it does make sense. Do you think the $3 million that they're paying Erik Swanson could work out for the best for them?
Well, like you said, when he was in Buffalo here, I mean, it was an absolute struggle. And I know Toronto fans saw that with Swanson when he got back to Toronto. Um, like you said, though, bullpen arms, you never can tell from year to year. And he did look better towards the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
With the major holes that they have in the bullpen with letting Romano go, I think it's a great move. Um, if you're gonna count on a guy to bounce back, I mean, he's a guy that you want to count on. Like you've seen him do it before, you've seen him do it
Does
in
have a
Toronto
track record.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got the track, and if you're gonna bet on somebody, that's the kind of guy that you want to bet on.
Hagen Danner is another guy that I think that the Blue Jays are finally going to give a shot to in the pen. And I know that we were talking about this in August, I think it was, where he
Hmm.
had come back from injury and he was the best bullpen arm in Buffalo. And Toronto desperately needed arms, and this was something I couldn't wrap my head around until I kind of figured out the reason for why he wasn't called up. He only has one option left, and I get the feeling they didn't want to burn that option on what they already knew was a relevant year in 2024. So, can you tell everyone who maybe doesn't know the ins and outs of Haggy D? You've seen him for years now in Buffalo. Toronto was lucky enough we thought we were going to see his major league debut. Saw 7 pitches and then he got injured. Kind of a sad story. And then he toiled away for the last year. What can Blue Jays fans expect out of Hagen Danner? I know his slider has made huge progress. Where are you at on the man they call Haggy D?
Well, I think, last year could have been a really good year for him if not for that injury. And I know I've talked with you about this before, like so much about being in AAA, and moving up to the big leagues. It depends on like being hot at the right time. And he got up and Danner got off to a good start this year. Toronto had so many struggles in the
Oh,
bullpen that
yeah.
it's hard to imagine that he wasn't headed for Toronto's bullpen if not for the injury. And so that really set him back. And when he came back, he looked well too. I mean, he finished with a 3.15 ERA. The
Mm-hmm.
the Bisons don't usually have a closer. Candell kind of likes to spread it around and use guys in different situations because his philosophy is that when they get to the major leagues, they're probably not going to be closing. They're going to be coming in sixth, seventh inning, so they got to be ready for anything. that being said, they usually kind of fall back on somebody ends up kind of being like a closer, like it was Brian Baker a few years ago, and then Matt Gage, and last year it was really Hagen Danner. I mean, he had seven, he missed all that time, but and ended up with
And still
seven
had
saves.
7 saves. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't have been up in Toronto in that bullpen last year, if not for the injury. So I definitely think he's got a good shot at even cracking the Blue Jays out of spring training. I mean, there's a lot of moves to be
There's
made
holes in that bullpen,
in
right? There's
the
jobs to
next
be had.
couple of months. So we'll see. I
Brandon
mean,
Little.
who knows what's going to happen with the bullpen in the next couple of months?
It's a huge question mark, Brian. It really is. Brandon Little is an interesting guy because the truth is, I didn't really expect him to get the call up when he did to begin with. I definitely didn't expect him to stick. And even more so, I didn't expect him to all of a sudden become the talked about lefty that might actually wind up with a job next year. What are your thoughts on Brandon Little, his career to this point, and just your belief in him to stick as a major league lefty in the bullpen?
I think that goes to what we were saying, year to year with guys in the bullpen, you don't know what you're going to get. He was a surprise of last season, and I definitely think he's got a good shot next year in the bullpen. He looked good when he was here in Buffalo, and then, definitely impressed when he got up to Toronto, kind of filling that role that like Tim Mesa used to have in the past. That's a
Hmm.
whole other story with Tim Mesa.
It is.
But yeah, I mean, he looked good, and he's got as good a chance of anybody as being, I mean, not just a part of the bullpen next year, but a really key piece being left-handed.
One last name before we move on from the bullpen, but and we touched on it in the preamble before we actually went to the public part of this show, but we touched on the only news we've seen so far in the last week has been Matthew Boyd signing a 2 year, $34 million deal, along, same deal for Frankie Montes.
Yeah.
Pitching is expensive right now. And that Yariel Rodriguez contract is all of a sudden looking pretty darn good. And we watched him as a starter, right? He struggled with length, but he tended to dominate in the first inning or two that he was in. Like it was just something he did quite well. When he was in Buffalo, I know you and I were there for his rehab game where I think he K'd 12 of his 14 batters or something like that. It was
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering your impression of Yariel Rodriguez watching him in Buffalo, but even more so, do you start to feel when you're looking at the landscape and stuff like this, Yariel might wind up in the bullpen for this Blue Jays club, and not only wind up in the bullpen, he might wind up in a fairly high leverage spot.
Well, he was completely dominant when he was in Buffalo, like you said. Like I mean, you could tell that was a good signing right away. Like he just dominated here, 1.33 ERA in 8 games. Um, with the way Bowden Francis pitched at the end of the year, you got to figure he'd been penciled in for one of those starting spots.
Exactly.
Having it Yariel Rodriguez, I mean, that's just, I don't want, it's a luxury, like, because he could go the starting route, he could go the relief route,
Hmm.
and having a guy like that with the kind of shambles that the Major League bullpen's in right now. Yeah, I mean, he could be a really key arm. I think, how he pitches kind of in spring training next year and to start the year is kind of going to define his role. And even if he does start in the bullpen, you could easily see, if there's an injury in the starting rotation or something, having him get stretched out a little bit and slide back into a starting role. So,
Hmm.
so and during the season, you need guys like that. You need a sixth and seventh starter, which, the last few years has kind of been a weak spot for Toronto, reaching down and getting that sixth, seventh, eighth starter down in AAA. So I kind of think he will start in the bullpen. We'll see, but easily could go back into the rotation depending on, what happens with the rotation.
which is a luxury this team hasn't had since probably Ross Stripling. I know that they had big plans for Mitch White of being that guy, and that just never really worked out.
Yeah. Another guy who kind of looked good towards the end here in Buffalo is Mitch White when he was here right at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, but things haven't panned out for him still.
So let's turn our attention then, Brian, to the starting rotation, because I do think it's fair to say that Mark Shapiro and Ross Atkins are going to go out and get a free agent starter. I don't know how um what the pedigree is going to be, like how high up that free agent ranking list do they go, right? Like I know there's rumors they're in on Corbin Burns and they're in on Max Fried, which really, let's say either way, that's irrelevant. Let's say they do get a starting pitcher, and then it's going to be that starting pitcher, Jose Barrios, Chris Bassett, Kevin Gosman, pencil in Bowden Francis, right? So there's your five. Now, I know we touched on depth and what a luxury Yariel Rodriguez has actually turned out to be going into 2025. Let's talk another couple guys here that has increased their depth. And I know the one gentleman, we have already brought his name up, and he was kind of the major piece in that Yusei Kikuchi trade at the deadline with Houston, where we saw Jake Bloss come back, number 3 prospect with the Blue Jays ranked right now. He started some games in Buffalo. I think it was end of August when he started getting some starts there, right? And
Right.
and you
Yep.
watched him pitch throughout September. You actually had a chance to talk with him. So I'm curious on a few things. What was your impression of him just as a guy? When you had a chance to sit down, because I know you talked with him for over 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you saw out of his performance over his starts that you got to watch firsthand. And I'm curious on what you think is his timeline. Like, do you think he's going to push for a start out of spring training? Is this a guy that maybe they still want to give a little bit of leeway and he's a depth piece injury type of guy? Where does he fit into the Blue Jays 2025 plan, in your opinion?
Yeah, so first of all, when I talked with them, the things that really stand out, he's a really intelligent guy. He went to Lafayette College in Pennsylvania and majored in economics and math, I believe. Then went
Okay.
to Georgetown for a master's degree and uh, got a finance degree there, I believe.
Wait,
And
Jake
yes,
Bloss has a master's?
yeah, he's like a real in
Wow.
all like in all of his majors involve numbers. He's a big numbers guy.
A real
And
Tim Mesa, one in, one
yeah.
out, eh? Only one genius allowed on the Jays at a
Yeah.
time.
And yeah, so it's he's a really bright guy. Um very composed on the mound, very laid back. Um one of the things that kind of uh he on the mound for the Bisons, he was kind of up and down. Like, he'd have a good start and you'd be like, wow, and then kind of a rough start and a high. But the thing you got to remember about him, like we mentioned earlier, he really rocketed through the Astros system last year. Like started in high A. I think he had one AAA start with the Astros. He went from AA right to the Astros, but then I think he had like a rehab start in AAA or something. So he really doesn't have a lot of AAA experience yet. He's only 23 years old. So a lot of potential there, and but I think ideally, the Blue Jays probably want to see him start in Buffalo next
Mhm.
year and get a little bit more AAA experience and kind of be able to work with them in their system for a little bit. And then hopefully he is pushing for a spot, sometime during the year or acting as like a depth guy, if and when there is an injury in the rotation. So I would think that the Blue Jays would like a little more seasoning with him because you kind of forget how young he actually is and how little
Yeah.
minor league experience he has just because he had some major league experience when he came to the Blue Jays, but he really, really went up fast to the Astros system.
I think the other thing for all the Blue Jays fans out there to keep in mind when it comes to Jake Bloss, if you're looking at his numbers at AAA last year with the Blue Jays, do remember that this is a 23-year-old that was just dealt the biggest life thing that he's had to deal with in some time, right? Getting traded from the organization that drafted him, developed him, brought him up through their system, and all of a sudden he's in with Canada's one team,
Yeah.
right? So he's not just traded, but traded to the only team outside of the country he knows, and then gets stuffed into Buffalo, right? So like
Yeah.
it's
And
interesting. It's interesting. I'm excited to see how he does next year.
and really what it was too when you look at his numbers at Buffalo, like he was moving up a level. Like even though he had those three starts for the Astros, like he really was a double A guy who kind of got called up to fill in or whatever their situation was there at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And so like coming to triple A and pitching in Buffalo, it really was kind of moving up from double A and there is an adjustment period there as well. So he kind of got that his feet wet in triple A last year. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing him pitch next year, whether it's in Buffalo or Toronto.
We watched so many guys don both the Blue Jays and the Bison's jersey. In fact, I remember in August, you and I making that list of trying to come up with, I think we stopped counting at 24, and this was mid August. I think they hit over 30 guys that played
Incredible.
both in Buffalo and in Toronto, which really does go to show you how poor some performances went. It really does go to show you their struggle with staying healthy. It goes to show you just literally the best laid plans sometimes can just fall all to the wayside, which was basically the Blue Jays 2024 in a heartbeat. But there were some good stories. And I think the one story that really is the shining star of the Blue Jays Bisons to Toronto trek was Spencer Horowitz. And I'm curious, after watching Buffalo Bison baseball all year long, if you were to take a guess at 2025 Spencer Horowitz, who is the guy you're choosing to get the call up, maybe be no real shine on his star, but watch him succeed?
That's a great question. And I the guy who like immediately comes to mind when you ask that is Alan Roden.
Yeah.
Like he just looked so like when he came up, he really struggled in Buffalo at first. That's what I'm talking about, that adjustment to a new level.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a tough time. It's a tough time to go into a slump when you're just starting out at AAA because, there goes your confidence. And his first 26 games in Buffalo, he hit 193 and really looked lost at the plate. He made some little adjustments to I believe, his leg kick. And all of a sudden, July 28th to the end of the season, just, was just ripping the ball at the plate. He had 378 from July 28th on, 1.084 OPS, ended up with nine home runs total, was the Bison's MVP, even though I think it was 71 games he was there.
Yeah.
And just looked fantastic. And the thing I'd always heard about him coming up was that he didn't have a lot of power, and he's a good hitter, but doesn't. Well, he's got
He
enough,
started
and
to
it's
put,
coming along. Yeah, he
yeah.
looked really good, and I could, in fact, I might even be a little surprised if he doesn't play a little role at some point in Toronto next year.
Kind of the reverse Riley Terada, hey, where Riley came in just where to the point where you and I were like,
Yeah.
where did he come from? Like, how is this happening? And then he kind of settled down and he was still a good ball player by the end, but it just, I mean, he was what, hitting 350 and had something like 7 home runs in his first 2 weeks. It was crazy.
Yeah, and again, it was his first go around at AAA, so it'll be interesting to see how he
Mm-hmm.
develops next year as well. One of the interesting things with him, and like he kind of had odd like home road splits, Terada. He had 12 home runs, but nine of them were on the road. And I really don't, yeah, I think it's just kind of an odd thing. I really don't expect it to carry over next year if he's in Buffalo, but it's just kind of
We got
a
to
little
chalk that
quirky
up to
thing.
luck then. That's just like
I,
weird
I
baseball
think
stuff.
so, and
Yeah.
and I think the Bison's, even when he first came up and was really hot there, I want to say the Bisons were even on like one of their 2 week road trips that are kind of rare these days, but they were he was hot on the road and then came home. So I think that kind of had a little bit to do with it too. But hopefully that doesn't carry over next year and his second go around, if he is here in AAA, will be successful.
Speaking of Spencer Horowitz, 2023's version of Spencer Horowitz, Davis Schneider. And we're both big Davis Schneider guys. I mean, honestly, he has had nothing but time for both of us. He's been on the podcast literally when he was putting together the best small sample in Major League Baseball history. He was taking time to come on the walk off. He was coming to live shows that I was putting on, right? We do
Yeah.
these baseball towns where we bring in a bunch of like baseball analysts and stuff and just talk the game. And he came to one of those. And I was just blown away by the generosity of his time as a human, you know? Like he'd gone through some major life stuff with losing his brother and just, it was such a good story. And then to watch how much he struggled last year, as just such a fan of him as a person, was tough to watch because he did struggle. He tough to call what we watched him do a major league performance. Curious where you're at on Davis Schneider for 2025. What does the kid need to do now at 25 years old to stay in the major leagues? Because really, we watched his power dry up as of about June, and we just watched him not be able to hit lefties anymore, something he did quite well in Buffalo and with Toronto in 2023.
Yeah, and I'll start off like you. I couldn't say enough nice things about Davis Schneider. Like if you were to ask me who's the nicest player you've ever interviewed, he would definitely make the short list of being one of the nicest guys I've ever talked to. Um, and yeah, last year was a struggle, especially as the season wore on. He's always kind of been like a streaky hitter. I know when he was here in Buffalo, uh, he kind of got off to a slow start and then got hot. And I talked to him about, he talked to me about the fact that he's traditionally kind of been a slow starter and
Yeah.
gets hot as the year goes on. So that's what I kept thinking last year. I was like, well, I know he's a slow starter. He's gonna break out here. And it just kind of never happened, and I don't know if that's like a mechanical thing or like as positive and nice as he is, that's gotta wear on you after a
Oh,
while.
yeah.
And so getting a step away from the field for a few months here and going in fresh next year could take care of that, because it's got to be frustrating and tough to go through. So hopefully he can have a big bounce back year next year, and hopefully it's in the major leagues with the Blue Jays, because like you said, there's nobody that you'd rather pull for than him because he's just such a great guy.
So let's talk about the reality of what the Blue Jays are dealing with then. And I know you alluded to it without even saying it there, but Davis Schneider, Spencer Horowitz, Addison Barger, Jonathan Clase, Joey Loperfido, Ernie Clement, Will Wagner. I mean, you start listing them off and you're like, there is not room on this 26-man roster for all of these, for lack of a better way of putting it, bubble boys, right? Like they're kind of, aren't they major league players? Time will tell. But do we have the time for all of them? In your opinion, which guys do you think are most likely to stick around? Or is that not even a thing? Is it probably going to be more along the lines of, well, this organization really wanted this guy and we gave them the choice of five of them and that's who they picked? Like, is it going to be like a smorgasbord for the teams trying to get into trade talks with the Jays?
I mean, so, when I think about who I would expect to see in Toronto next year, I mean, like, I'm like, well, Spencer Horwitz stands out, and Will Wagner certainly.
Mhm.
Uh, Ernie Clement, he's
Yeah.
how could you not see him there? Leo Jimenez can play some shortstop,
I
but
forgot
like
about
then you're
Leo.
like, well,
Yes.
there's not enough spots, and a lot of it I think might not have so much to do with them as almost just like how the roster shapes out over the next couple of months, hopefully the next couple of weeks even.
Yeah, no
Um,
kidding.
but it's just kind of like, you know, you can only have so many second basemen, you can only have so many middle infielders because, so do they sign a third baseman? Like how does that all shake out, And there's just so many questions that will be answered in the next couple months that, and some of those guys that you envision being in Toronto next year, they might be the guys who are traded for a reliever or whatever, So it's kind of a wishy-washy answer by me, but
I
I
mean,
I think
we're
the
in
roster makeup,
wishy-washy times, Brian.
yeah, the roster makeup though is going to have so much to do with who actually ends up in the big leagues with Toronto or possibly elsewhere.
I mean, and that's the truth of it is that a lot of this isn't probably going to work out until the new year because there is still so many question marks around who are the Blue Jays chasing in free agency? What direction are they taking there? Are they going after an infielder? Are they going after an outfielder? Who is on the way out? Where do you want to pare down the redundancies? I know that's one thing that we've talked about a few times on the podcast here on the walk off with Adam and I is just Will Wagner and Spencer Horwitz. They're probably the two best out of that group we just named when it comes to the sample sizes. But could you get two players that look more alike when you start
And
writing out what their strengths are on paper, right? High average guys, double dudes, not a ton of power, get a hold of one here and there, play second base, not a lot of versatility, like left handed bats. Do you need two of those?
that's what I mean, and I know you saw the same thing in Toronto, but Will Wagner was only in Buffalo for like 7 games, and immediately I was like, "Wow, he looks like Spencer Horwitz," and that's a heck of a compliment because Horwitz dominated here in Buffalo.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. I mean, they look like the same, very similar players, and both with good careers ahead of them. And it's just kind of how the roster shapes out because obviously you have to make a spot for Juan Soto in the lineup too. So
That's right. Very true, Brian. I'm glad you brought that up.
yeah, I
Uh,
didn't know how long we could go without bringing up that name. So I
Bringing
didn't
up
know.
Juan Soto. It is
Yeah,
so funny having a chance to talk with Ben Nicholson Smith, and I brought up that MLB.com, the main headline was executives are predicting the Blue Jays come in with the
yeah,
highest offer. And he was just like, the eye roll he held back. Like I could just tell he
yeah.
was just like, "Oh, come on."
It's
Like and he even said he's like, "Listen, I don't know who these executives they're talking to are. I have not gotten any word of that sort of thing." He's like, "There are 5 teams involved. The Blue Jays are one of them, and that's what we know." Like
yeah, and especially with what we went through last offseason with Otani, I think everybody is kind of stepping back here and like, let's
kind of
just
the
let it
fool me
play out.
once, shame
Yeah,
on me type of idea, right? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. All right. I know that probably the biggest black mark on a player that was really good with this team and then took a big dive last year. That was really poorly worded, but here we are. Bichette. All of this to get into Bichette and what an absolutely bummer of a season he had. Injury marred, performance was bad when he was in the lineup. He seemed disengaged. And then later he did come out and kind of clear up that a little bit. And he did vocalize that he did really want to stay with Vladdy. You've got to talk with Bo Bichette when he was a Bison, and you know him a little bit as a person, and obviously speculating what 18-year-old wanted when he was still playing in Buffalo and what he wants now are two different things. But I am curious on your thoughts on Bo Bichette if he is going to rebound in 2025. I personally think, how can he not? I mean, he can't be worse than 2024, right? And even more so, do you believe all the narrative around Bo doesn't want to be in Toronto anymore?
Um, I think he's going to come back and have a big year. And I don't know how you could look at a guy who at his age has led the American League in hits twice and really should have done it a third time if not for injury. and not think that he's going to bounce back. You know, it was one bad year. He kind of had, injuries throughout the year, nagging injuries, and everything just kind of snowballed into a bad year. But I never, even when people were saying that he seemed disengaged or seemed like he didn't want to be in Toronto, I never believed that. Like he's just got a different personality than Vladdy or, you know, Teoscar Hernandez or something like that. He's just so
Yeah.
much more laid back. Even when you talk to him, even when you talk to him in a press conference, he's just kind of so much more laid back. And it's not a bad thing. He's just got a different personality than those guys. And, you know, he's driven to succeed on the field. He's just not like doesn't have that outgoing kind of personality that Vladdy has, which might be one of the most outgoing personalities in the game, and
Yeah.
Vladdy and guys like that. So he's just got a different personality, and so I never really bought the whole he doesn't want to be in Toronto thing. I think he does want to be in Toronto and be successful now. Whether that's going to be a long-term thing with all the contract status of him and Vladdy and everything going forward, who knows how that's going to play out. But I do expect him to have a big year yet next year, absolutely.
Brian, I always love chatting baseball with you, my friend, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to come on the show here. I figured I'd leave with a guy, just talking a guy that we got to watch quite often in Buffalo and wound up being, I mean, outside of Vladdy's year and Spencer Horowitz, I mean, I think you can name the three positives of this year's team. Vladimir Guerrero Jr. rebounding to 2021 form, the emergence of Bowden Francis and Spencer Horowitz. And
Yeah.
Bowden Francis, I remember talking to you about him after seeing him in spring training, and I was just like, man, that curveball is so good. And I literally, Brian, remember you saying, if he can figure out another pitch to pair with that, look out. And then I
Yeah,
forgot about it.
and
And he struggled up and down and went through an injury here and there. And then all of a sudden, along comes Bowden Francis with a splitter, and it changed him as a pitcher. Now, obviously, baseball is all about adjustments and readjustments. And we watched him make that adjustment and dominate. I mean, literally go take a no hitter into the ninth and then do it again the next game. Insanity.
yeah.
Do you believe in what you saw out of Bowden Francis? And I'm not saying, do you think he's the best pitcher in baseball ever? That's not what I mean. But do you think that the major league number three we saw out of him is a possibility? And what do you expect out of him for 2025? Reasonable expectations. What's a successful 2025 for Mr. Francis?
You know, I do believe in him, and there was something about like the last time he came to Buffalo. There was just something about watching him on the mound, and he had that splitter, and he'd been relieving, but then he was finally getting back to starting. And I talked to him when he was in Buffalo, and he just seemed so happy and relieved to be back starting again. And I think just that comfortability of knowing that you're going to go out there every 5 or 6 days and being back in a role that he was comfortable with, and of course having that splitter uh was great. And I just had a feeling he was going to go back and be successful in Toronto. And I talked to him just like they had the doubleheader in Baltimore when he got called up, and I kind of figured he was going to get called up for that doubleheader. And so I talked to him a few days before he went up because I was like, I got to talk to him before he leaves here. And I, obviously I didn't think he was going to almost throw two no hitters and things like that, but I had a good feeling about him going back up, and
Hey, I
then
will say you believed before I believed.
I
Like
did.
you did. Like
Yeah, and
uh,
he's another great guy who I love to talk to. He's just so laid back and such like an original personality. And but yeah, I believe, and I think a successful 2025 for him is kind of, being in the rotation all year long. And I believe that he can be, a number two or three starter, and kind of a very important cog in the Blue Jays starting rotation. And I think that's it for him. Go out there and get your 25 starts or more, and uh, you know, going out there every fifth or sixth day, and obviously not throwing no hitters every time out, but or close to no hitters every time out. But yeah, I'm excited to see where he's going to go from here next season.
His length is what impressed me at the end. Him going constantly 6, 7, 8 innings. Also taking two no hitters into the ninth
Yeah.
was also very impressive, but just his length. So I'm going to ask you this: over under 150 innings.
Um, I'm gonna be up. I'm the eternal optimist, so I'm gonna go over it. I'm gonna say over 150 innings.
Toxic positivity. You're on the right
Yeah,
show. I'm also
exactly.
going to take the over. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining. Honestly, I know that all of our listeners really do appreciate your insight and getting a little peek into the world that is the Buffalo Bisons. And I mean, in the off season, what better time to talk baseball that isn't surrounding news that happened today?
Yeah. Hey,
Because we
there's
don't have any of that.
exactly. We're still waiting on that, but hopefully soon. But I couldn't think of anything better to do at the beginning of December than to be able to talk about baseball. So thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Everyone listening, check out the Herd Chronicles. It is where you get the best information on the Buffalo Bisons. Brian, enjoy your December. A Merry Christmas. Happy holidays to you and yours. And I can't wait till the next time I twist your arm and get you back on the show.
All right, looking forward to seeing you again soon.